Hello, hello. What's going on?
What's up? I'm about to take my second red eye of the week, so I'm very excited about that.
Oh, geez.
Yeah.
One sounds like more than enough for the week. So we don't have Jason here with us this week, unfortunately, but we do have DHH fresh off of Rails World. So it was quite a fun time in Toronto. And I was going to say it felt way bigger this year because I would see people and be like, oh, I need to talk to them. And then I wouldn't see them for 2 days. It felt giant. So welcome, David.
Thank you. Yes, the venue was giant compared to the Rails World we did in Amsterdam. I think it was literally 4 or 5 times as large as that venue. And then, of course, there were also just a lot more people. We were just over 1,000 people at this Rails World. And at the last one, I think we were just over 600. So no wonder it felt bigger. But I think also just the energy felt bigger. The fact that we had timed it so serendipitously with Rails 8 release, the fact there was just so much new stuff, the fact that we had come off already having proven the Rails World approach in Amsterdam. So this was sort of like, all right, we got this. This is just going to roll. And then we're going to take it to a bigger stage. I think it was just incredible. I'm obviously hopelessly biased in this regard, but this was one of the best tech conferences I have ever been to. And I've been to a few over 20 some years, including a bunch of ones in Rails and Ruby Worlds and all sorts of other venues. But the fact that Amanda treated the environment of the conference with this level of care and ambition, that was something I didn't even really know mattered as much as it did until I saw it in action. The fact that the venue can have such a big impact on the vibe, that it's not just about what we're going to talk about. It's not just about what we're going to release. It's also about what are the physical surroundings where we do it. I did not appreciate that, I will say, until Amanda insisted on A, B, C, D, and E that this was going to happen. I remember in Amsterdam, I think she got this huge rail sign for the entrance. It was right in front of where you would write when you started with Rails or something like that. And I remember seeing how much that was going to cost. And I was, Amanda, really? Do we need this? Is that important? And it is. It is that important. It's not about that sign. It's about the whole thing. Someone showed a level of care to prepare the venue for us that just goes so far beyond that I felt an obligation to really show up with my A game. I was going to say, I can't just wing it. I always wing it. But I had to wing it to a degree that felt proportionate to the venue, that felt worthy of the venue. And that was just delightful. It was also just delightful, obviously, to have over 1,000 people. I had so many conversations with so many excited Rails programmers. They could feel it, right? It was that sense of you go to a great concert. You may know the tracks. Like, it's not like they're necessarily playing any new music you've never heard before, but a lot of the experience is in sharing it with a bunch of others and then walking away from that with a new level of inspiration. And that's something I heard from several people. So excited about it. Can't wait to get back and write some Ruby, write some Rails.
Yeah. Speaking of the signs, I remember that was one of the things we walked in Amsterdam and was, whoa, this sign is huge. And then you saw afterwards all the pictures. People were taking photos in front of that sign, and that made a huge difference. And I remember also seeing in Amsterdam above the 2 doors to walk into the 2 different tracks, there's a half circle custom sign cut out there. Now, I just saw that and thought for a second, that had to be kind of a pain in the butt to design and then cut out and then apply and everything just for the 2 days of the conference. And that's the attention to detail that I saw again this year, but even better. And man, it just sets the default level of excitement. And then people arrive and start talking to each other and catching up because we haven't seen some of them ever. Some of the people I haven't seen since Amsterdam or whatever. And that just like has been such a good time. So this was an awesome time. And it's cool that we're going back to Amsterdam next year. I had my fingers crossed for somewhere new like Paris or something, but I also appreciate the sheer amount of work that Amanda has to put into those conferences. So Amsterdam seems like a good call.
At a number of other potential venues in Europe, but one of the constraints was, do you know what? If we want to keep the price affordable, if we don't want to go to $1,000, $1,200 for a ticket, we have to do it in a place where it doesn't have to be outfitted from scratch. And we also have to do it in a way where it feels proportionate to the Rails Foundation's budget. The Rails Foundation has decided and did decide quite early on, you know what, we're going to lose money on these conferences. We're going to subsidize these conferences for the betterment of the ecosystem, and that's going to be worth it. But you know what? If we could just lose only like $100,000 a conference, that'd be nice. We can't really take on a loss of $300,000, $400,000. And that was one of the things that made it easier to pick Amsterdam again. It's a super special venue. And it also is a venue that, unlike a lot of other venues of that caliber, has a lot of the materials we need. Like that amazing screen, for example, is something that's just there on set. In Toronto, that had to be built and brought in. And it's just eye-wateringly expensive, given the fact that inflation has not made any of this stuff easier. And if you're trying to keep these affordable price points where an individual investing in their own career can justify it to themselves, you got to look at all those factors and go, you know what, we need something super cool. We also need it to be affordable, and we can't spend the entire budget that the Rails Foundation has to do all of its work on just this one thing. So I think Amsterdam is going to be great. And Amanda already has ideas for how to use the venue in a new way such that we can fit a larger conference. One of the good problems, I guess you could say, we've had is that the first Rails World sold out in 40 minutes. The second one's sold out in 20 minutes. So I don't know if you just plot that, the next one is going to sell out in 10 minutes. And that's not really the point, right? The point is to create a conference where people who are excited about Rails can come and enjoy everything. And we have to weigh that. But it gets quite difficult to do something that's both cool and affordable once you cross 800 to 1,000 people. You need a completely different class of venues. And most of the venues that fit into the 1,000 plus, if it has to be even somewhat affordable, are these drab Sheraton conference hotel style that I'm not going back to that. After having tasted what Amanda can do with a really cool venue, there is no freaking way I go back to some stained carpet somewhere with some round tables with white cloth on and a pitcher and a notepad. That's just not going to happen, right? Like we can't do that. So we've set essentially the floor in terms of excitement and quality, and we have to maintain that while balancing all the things, which is what's kind of the fun of it too. There are constraints. We can't just do whatever. If you are a huge company and you're putting on a company conference, you can very well just say, well, we're just going to spend $2 million, $3 million, $5 million on this show, and you can justify that. That's not how it works here. There's not a commercial backing behind the Rails Foundation beyond the budget. It has to fulfill its entire mission. No one is making money off it directly. So anyway, I think it's going to be amazing. And I really like the fact that we are going back to Europe, that it wasn't just a one-off. Europe, for very many years, had a bunch of really nice Ruby conferences. It did not have any dedicated major Rails conference. And that's obviously the focus of the Rails Foundation, is to put on those great shows. So I look forward to that. I mean, Amsterdam is also just a cool city, and it's a very accessible city. It's easy for people from the US to get there, which is quite important for me as well now. I live on the west coast of the US. If I have to do 2 transfers to get somewhere, that is going to dampen my enthusiasm a little bit for that amount of travel. But Amsterdam is just so well connected. So that's how it all added up.
Speaking of making money off of Rails, when are we going to get that Rails IPO?
So I seriously thought for a half second that there was some joke I hadn't been let in on, that every developer tool chain framework, whatever, seems to be announcing their venture capital funding round. And I was like, wait, did we just decide that this is what we were going to do? No, we didn't. We did not decide that. And again, I don't want to throw shade on whatever other folks want to do with their creations and their ecosystems. I think it's great that we have choice. I think it's great that people are trying different paths. But I also know that that is not the path I want for Rails. I do not want a Rails corporation, a Rails Inc. that has to 10x some $50, $100 million check from a VC. Not only do I don't personally want that pressure, I don't want to put that pressure on the ecosystem, and I don't want to see what happens when the average outcome is achieved. The average outcome of a venture-backed startup is failure. That's the average. The majority of them fail. The math is quite simple. You invest in 10. One of them has to pay for the fact that essentially the rest of them, if not fail, turn out to be these sort of at best base hits. And all of them are going to be put into screws that are, you should be trying to become that one that just takes off to the moon because you got to pay for the lot here. And I've seen that with a lot of startups. It's quite often not very pretty. And the actions people can get forced into taking, even it's not what they want. I don't think that any of these startups that get under the pressure cooker that is venture capital, when the hockey stick line isn't so hockey sticky, mean to do the things that they do. They just have an obligation to pay back an enormous sum of money with a fantastical sum of money. And that's very difficult to do. And you sometimes will end up essentially in a environment where no one is even twisting your arm. This is one of the things about venture capital that I don't think most outside observers realize. It's rarely that the money people go like, you have to do this. You have to do this, otherwise consequences. No, it's the sense of obligation from people who have taken the money, who feel like, you know what, I'm just going to flex my morals or my ethos a little bit, such that maybe this can happen. I just don't have any interest in that. And I also understand, though, that that's a privileged position, as we used to call it about 4 years ago, where everything was a privilege. But it is a privileged position to be in a place where I don't need to make money off Rails. I've made my money somewhere else. And all the folks, all the companies, for example, involved in the Rails Foundation, they're making their money somewhere else. They don't need to monetize the framework. So we are then allowed to do things in a different way. If you have not made your money in that way, if you created something that a lot of people are excited about, I can completely understand the temptation to take a lottery coupon from the venture capital world and hope that it pans out or at least take some money off the table. All of this is totally human temptations. And I wish them all the best with whatever they do. They're not all going to succeed. Let's just be honest about that, though, right? It's not all going to succeed. Some of it might get a little dicey when it doesn't. Just these past weeks, there have been several examples of open sourcey companies who've taken very large sums of money, who get themselves into sticky situations because of that pressure. And we're just not going to do that with Rails. We can still make all sorts of other mistakes, and I'm sure we both have and will, but it won't be this class of mistakes. And I think that's one of the wonderful things about working with the internet, is that we have all this choice, and we can have one framework over here chasing one direction. We can have one ecosystem over there going something entirely different. That gives us resilience to the web. Sometimes some of these things might work out and they might contribute back to the broader internet web development world, and we might benefit from that. That's great. And other times it might not turn out. And if it doesn't, then there are alternatives. So I've gotten more at peace at looking at it that way. I think an earlier version of myself would have taken to the keys and wrote some spicy tweets, dunking on left, right, and center. Do you know what? Don't need to do that. Don't need to do that. And in fact, I'm happy that we have this variety. And I'm also happy that it allows us to draw this contrast, that we can say, do you know what? That's not Rails. Rails can be a bunch of things. It's not that. And I think you get some clarity and some cohesion around your ecosystem when you are explicit about what your values are, your aspiration, and your mission. This is one of the reasons I spend so much time in the Rails World keynote to talk about that mission as I see it for Rails 8. What's the overarching idea here? It's not just a collection of new libraries. It's not just a collection of new features and bug fixes. It's also that, but they serve, at least in my optics, towards a grander vision that Ruby on Rails should be able to go straight to production without having to pay some platform as a service vendor 10, 100x the cost of the hardware to do so. And we should aspire to have the developer ergonomics be as good as those commercial offerings, as good as Heroku used to be, as good as all these new framework-specific clouds are trying to be. And I think that's immensely doable. This is not outside the realm of what open source is good at. I run Linux now full-time, and I see some of the areas where open source perhaps is not as good as commercial software. The age-old GIMP versus Photoshop is perhaps a good illustration of this. There's a level of polish that open source has a hard time achieving when the target audience is average person end user. But it's almost the opposite when it comes to the target audience of developers. Open source is generally better at arriving at something great for developers because it's made by developers. They're working for themselves. They're solving their own problems, and they are obsessive about getting that as good as it can be. That's why you cannot buy a Rails competitive framework. Even if you said, you know what, I have $100,000. I'm going to spend it on the most luxurious Rails competitive framework. You're not going to get anything better. It doesn't exist because Rails is the product of not only 20 years of refinement, but almost 7,000 contributors who have code directly in the framework. That's simply not doable for any individual company. There are companies who try. Microsoft has tried a lot of different varieties in this realm. I'd say they are generally only successful when they also control the means of distribution. Microsoft can be the best stack if you want to make a Windows app. Apple can be the best stack when you want to make an iOS app or a Mac OS app. And they can be that because, you know what? They own the toll booth. The internet is not like that. The internet is not owned by someone. There's no prescription. There's no vertical integration you can make. There's no one who owns HTTP 2. That is an open standard, and that is why it's very difficult for commercial software to be competitive. Now, I do think that occasionally they can show the way. They can shine a light on an area where open source perhaps have been sleeping a little bit. I think deployment economics to me is the ideal example of that. As I talked about in the keynote, Heroku could be so far ahead for so long is, to me, a little embarrassing on behalf of open source technology. And I actually look at my own work in this realm and go like, it's a little embarrassing that I slept on it so long. And I also know why I did that. We have a crack team of operators at 37 Signals who do this work. They see all the things that are cumbersome. Let's put it like that. And it was really not until I dove into this problem space with our move out of the cloud that I saw just how cumbersome it actually is, how much complexity is actually just accidentally there, and how much of it we could just clear the tables. We could flip over that damn table and go, you know what, clean sheet of paper. What are some of the core tools that have been developed for a long time? Oh, Docker? Oh, Docker's good. You can use Docker in a really simple way. It's actually, in my opinion, true leap forward. We can take that, we can put it together with this, we can do some Kamal, we can build default Docker files into the Rails distribution. We can do all the things so that it becomes essentially turnkey to do. We can reduce it all to a single command. This, to me, is what Heroku showed us. Deployment can be git push. Holy shit, really? Huh, awesome. We've had versions of that. I mean, Capistrano back in the day was, by the time you've set it all up, was obviously also one command. But by the time you've set it all up, does a lot of work in that sentence. And with Kamal, the idea from the get-go was, do you know what? We're not into pet servers anymore. Pet servers can be wonderful. You can name them and you can tend to them and do all the little stuff. Kamal is for cattle management. And the cattle is going to come in undifferentiated as commodities with no pre-baking, no pre-setup. We're just going to require whatever. And a fresh Ubuntu box has everything you need to deploy with Kamal, because Kamal would download and install Docker itself, do all the stuff. And that's where we can get to. And I think we're essentially there, which is also a little surprising to me that to some degree it wasn't harder. If something hasn't been done that is valuable for many, many years, you've got to think, well, it's because it's hidden behind dragons or something. It's got to be really difficult to get to the gold. And I found it wasn't that difficult. And maybe sometimes it's because the underlying tech has improved. Like Docker is really good. It's been honed for a very long time and da-da-da-da-da. This was one of those other points I brought up in the keynote, the hash invalidation of mental models. It's a really difficult problem for a lot of programmers. They get their head set on a certain view of the world, and that view of the world is most likely correct for the time frame it was created. The problem is you keep accumulating a 2016, 2019 mental model, and you gotta be ready to flush some of that stuff when the context changes.
Yo, quick question for you. Do you want higher clarity into production but don't have the time to become a wizard in observability? Honeybadger Insights is exactly what you need. Forget the old school trio of logs, metrics, and traces. We're talking structured events that don't just sit there. They're your treasure map to solving mysteries in your app. With Honeybadger, sling your logs and events into the mix and voila, you just unlock the power of Honeybadger's new query language, BadgerQL. It's like having a conversation with your data. Ask it anything. Turn mishaps into metrics and showcase your wins on dashboards that even the marketing team will drool over. And guess what? This isn't just for big spenders. Honeybadger's got you covered with a free plan that packs a punch, including error tracking, uptime monitoring, sleek status pages, and more. Oh, and speaking of errors, Honeybadger treats them like VIPs at the club. With Insights and BadgerQL, your errors aren't just problems, they're opportunities. Explore your data in ways you didn't think were possible and get the insights that you deserve. Check out honeybadger.io. That's right, honeybadger.io.
I think a lot of conversation comes up with why didn't Kamal use Caddy instead of building Kamal Proxy and Thruster? But that's part of your solution to that, which is if we start from scratch from first principles, we know Caddy exists and it's doable, but we can then skip some of those things that are the cruft in your brain that has been something that like, oh, we just always use Nginx and we have to have that. But then Nginx goes its own way and starts charging for load balancing features and whatever else. And I just want to point that out, that starting from scratch oftentimes gives you that insight into those little decisions that have just built up in your brain and stayed there and been cached for 20 years. And it gives you the opportunity to clear it out and think about it again from first principles. Do we need all the features of Caddy? Probably not. And I think that's probably why you didn't do traffic, but now you have Kamal Proxy because of probably that reason, right?
And that's exactly right. And it's funny, in this case, Kamal was a clean sheet of paper. Like it wasn't a fork of Capistrano. And then let's try to tweak that. I went, you know what? I'm going to assume one premise. I'm going to assume Docker. I'm going to assume that I'm going to use Docker for all of the packaging of the containers and whatnot. And then everything else from there, I'm going to evaluate. And with the proxy component, it was interesting because we did evaluate both Caddy and traffic from the beginning. It was funny. I think actually the Caddy author chimed in on a thread on X about this topic. And I was trying to remember what it was about Caddy that did not line up right away. Why did we pick traffic in the first case? I think it was something about Docker labels and how we could easily discover that there was a new deployment and traffic was a little bit better in that regard. I don't fully remember, but we did.
Yeah,
go
that
through all
sounds
of it
right.
because I don't have a love for writing Go proxies. It's not like, oh, yes, I just wake up in the morning. I want to make another Go proxy. That's not the source of inspiration here. The source of inspiration was we went with traffic and we realized we needed a bunch of, I don't know if I want to say hacks, but it's kind of hacks. Kamal had this idea of a core that you had to connect because we wanted zero gap deploys. And I actually thought that that was one of the things traffic provided out of the box. And with some rigorous testing, especially at scale, we found out kind of it wasn't. It didn't just give it to you automatically. You were still going to produce some 500s in this shift between the A and the B. And maybe that's because if you run traffic inside of Kubernetes, that does some of the stuff for you and it does some of the live health checking and so forth. We didn't have that. We didn't want that, obviously. Kamal is in many ways a refutation of Kubernetes as a requirement for this kind of work. Nothing bad about Kubernetes at the grand scale. You're not going to use Kamal to deploy whatever Google Cloud product or Google Cloud engine. They need enterprise software to run their whatever mega cloud. Great. When we try to use that software that was designed for the mega clouds and I just have 5 servers I need to deploy, a little bit of cognitive dissonance there between what our needs are and what's provided. So we started with traffic. We realized we had to kind of patch a bunch of things and it wasn't super fast. And then the tipping point for me actually was 2 features. One was if you want to provision your own SSL certificate, you needed to do some kind of finicky traffic label stuff. You had to do your own little dance to get Let's Encrypt to do it. And I saw a lot of people stumble over just that. Even though once you know it, if you're a traffic expert, that's easy. It's just 4 labels and you just get the, yeah, of course it's easy. You know all the stuff. I don't want a new Rails user to have to be a traffic expert. I don't want them even to know that Kamal has a proxy. That is knowledge that you can eventually dive into as your needs become more sophisticated and whatnot. But the whole mission here in Rails is we compress that initial on-ramp to almost 0 so that you can be that dog in front of the keyboard that doesn't know anything on day 1. And I'm not going to inject knowledge or a requirement of knowing traffic labeling. That doesn't fit with that ethos and that mission, which is why, as we just talked about, it's important to also have the bird's eye view. What are we doing? Why are we doing it? In service of what? It's not just about features. It's not just about capabilities. It's about the accessibility of those capabilities and where they arrive on the curve. Because I've seen some of the pushback to this idea, for example, around, I don't know, no builder or whatever, where perhaps there are concepts that eventually you have to learn. I'm like, I'm not against people becoming good at stuff. In fact, that's the whole pitch here. I want day 1 to lead to the first dopamine loop where you do Hello World in your little app. You don't know how anything works, but you somehow see Hello World on your own local computer. And then you can do like Kamal deploy and what? It's live? It's online? That's a dopamine loop that'll hopefully hook you so that you'll keep on to the ramp. And one day you'll know all about proxies. You'll know all about how they work. And maybe you want to stick traffic in front because you want some features it has that Kamal proxy does not have. Great. That is knowledge and lessons for a later day. You're not going to show up in a university and like, yeah, day 1 here is we're going to take the exit exam. All the stuff that it takes you 4 years to get, we're going to quiz you on it right now. And that's going to determine whether you are allowed to continue. What? No. You got to space it out. You got to have sort of the whole loop in mind. So with the proxy question, we just ended up making traffic do the things we want to do at the level of 0 config ambition that we have is kind of more difficult than just writing the proxy from scratch. And some of that is because Go is really good at writing proxies. Go as a language just has a bunch of fundamentals for exactly that kind of work because that's the environment it was born in. And we happen to have someone on our team who's good at that. Kevin is really good at writing Go proxies. He is the author of both Thruster and the Kamal proxy. So we could do it. We could take the clean sheet of paper and go, do you know what? There's some very mature projects here, Traffic and Caddy. They're great. They're good. They can do a lot of stuff. They've been battle tested out the wazoo. Wonderful. They're the Swiss Army knives. I just need a letter opener. I don't need 28 tools. I just need to open the letter here. And again, as I said, the features that drove us to this was auto provisioning of SSL certificates has been reduced to 1 line of configuration. Proxy, SSL, true, that's it. The next one is host. You also sort of need that for the certificate. But in terms of turning this on as a feature, that's it. That's the conceptual compression I live for. To take something that required knowledge of the inner workings of traffic to set up just the right labels, and if it didn't work, you also didn't know why it would break, and reduce it to the outcome I'm looking for, SSL true. Now I have SSL. Whoa, what? That's awesome. That's really good. The second one was multiple apps on a single server. And this was one of the ones that was not on our radar because the environment Kamal was born in was bringing hay off the cloud. And we're not trying to cram hay into a single server. I mean, I'd love to do that one day. Once computers get fast enough for that, we're going to run it all in SQLite on some 1200 core mega beast. But right now, the problem we have is we have a fleet of servers. We have a lot of servers, and we even have namespace, and you have these web servers, and you have these job servers, and you have this, that, and the other thing. We weren't thinking about the other direction. No. My service is so small, I can fit many of them on a single box, which is exactly what most people will start out with. They will start out with, I have a few different hobby projects. I don't want to buy a new cloud VM every time I launch something new. And I also saw the traffic labeling hoop-de-doop you had to do to get that. And I didn't like that at all either. So I went, you know what? If you went to the Kamal GitHub page and you looked at the discussions, what are people asking for? Like 97%, those two questions. How do I get SSL working? Can I deploy multiple apps on a single box? And we went like, you know what? We could solve this problem. And in solving it, get rid of some of the other issues that we have. Get rid of some of the clutches and hacks we have to get true zero-gap deploys. And we can speed up the deployment process along with it. We can build Kamal proxy specifically for just what Kamal needs. It makes it a very small proxy. I don't even care about the overhead. Someone yesterday just did a performance comparison to Caddy. And yeah, Kamal proxy did very well because it almost does nothing. And I usually hate those freaking comparisons. People will go like, well, you can do 15,000 requests a second on a mega box with Rails. Like, that's nothing. I can do 100,000 saying hello world and Go. Yeah, your Go app doesn't do anything. Impressive that you can send a string in that amount of time. And that's great. But that's not what Rails does, right? Rails is, for web application development, the Swiss Army knife. So of course it's going to be slower. So I don't care. That's not what we did it. The proxy is virtually never the bottleneck in all of this stuff. It doesn't matter. But what does matter, for example, is whether we can deploy in 29 seconds versus 48. I don't know if it literally is always the 20% gap. That's probably an ideal case. But the fact that we could make everything substantially quicker because the whole dance of the zero gap was made easier was a big motivating factor as well. And then also just the fact that we could solve these problems people had. We could improve our own standing. We could get something bespoke just for us without taking on a lot of technical, I was about to say debt. That's not what it is. Technical baggage. Let's put it like that. There could be good stuff in there. We just, hey, I'm going for a weekend. I'm not fucking packing for Jules Verne's 90 days around the world. Just a little weekend bag. I like not to check luggage. That's what Kamal proxy essentially is. A carry-on.
And you've got to be kind of relentless about if your goal is it is set up and deploy is the only two things you have to run. You have to kind of cut down what are we going to support? Because I can't imagine the decisions in Rails for things like Active Record, where it's like we ideally want to support literally every use case you could ever want here, but that's not possible to do. And that makes it tough. One thing you mentioned during your keynote, very briefly, was the need for a Docker registry maybe is going away, which I wanted to ask about because I think that is one of those things where it's where in Docker Hub do I go to find the API key? Then, only one image is free at a time or whatever. And that seems to be, they'd like to raise their pricing too. And it feels like
fails half the time to download the image in CI.
Yeah, I don't want that either. I think what's nice about the registry setup is that it already is a standard. And Docker Hub is just one of multiple providers. You can also do it on GitHub. You can do it in a bunch of different places. But even in all those places, it's too convoluted for my taste. The reason we have it in part is, again, what was the context Kamal was born in? For us, having a registry, we already have that. That's not the stumbling block. But I want to keep compressing that complexity for day one usage, and it should not require a subscription through Docker Hub. I think Docker Hub is actually a really fine registry, and it's very fast. Maybe it also sometimes has some issues, but the stumbling block of figuring out even where do I copy the key from is too much. We want to get all that out of the loop. So we've been thinking about ways to get rid of that while not losing the magic that is layer caching. One of the reasons why Kamal is able to be so efficient and quick in its deploy is because Docker is built with this idea of layered caches. If you look at something like Capistrano, it didn't have that. And it had to sort of send all of it at once and whatnot, which just had some limitations in terms of how fast you could go. So I don't want to lose that. But we have some really good ideas about how you can retain that, involving some rsync and some SSH and this, that, and the other thing. This is something Donald has been looking into, and he believes he has a clear shot from here to there. I want to get to that. And then there won't even be that part. It'll just essentially be you're going to have a local cache. Maybe we can put the cache on the server. We've got to figure out. Another thing that's nice about layer caching is you share it when you deploy in a team. If I deploy, the caches are hot for Jeremy to deploy after me and just has to deploy that one layer that changes. So definitely want to solve that problem too. And essentially continue to drive this big picture vision. What are we trying to do? Make Hello World as simple as possible, get the dopamine flowing, then enable the two-part, the getting into production part, to be just as simple, to allow for just as much, and I say this actually as a term of endearment, just as much ignorance, right? You don't know. That's what ignorance is. You don't know. And everyone who shows up on day one don't know. How can we reduce the burden of the things they must know to get started? And then again, they can figure out what registries are and how to set them up by the time they have a whole team, and maybe they have a pipeline, maybe they have this, that, and the other thing. Great. That's a day, hopefully 28 problem. It's not a day one problem. So I'm really excited for that. And I'm really excited for continuing to also just push the speed of these deploys. For me, the gold standard is, what was it Peter Levels said on the Friedman show, that he deploys in like 10 seconds or something? I lodged that in my little brain here and like, okay, that's the target. Can we get to 10 seconds? I want to get to 10 seconds. I just published part of the new Kamal 2 video that I'm doing for the website, the bit where I'm deploying a Go application, because I just wanted to show Kamal is not just for Rails. It actually works for anything you can wrap up in a Docker container. And I think I could do it in like 28 seconds. We're not actually that far off the magic of the 10 seconds. Now, can you do that with a larger application? It's a little harder, especially if you deploy to a whole fleet of servers. Peter isn't doing that. He has the one box. I love all the stuff he's doing for that and sort of the shining light he brought. What is all this complexity? I fucking run whatever it is, like 80 services on one goddamn box. I use SQLite and I'm making millions of dollars. So I love that example to just show how far we can go. But that's not the reality we have for Hey, for example. I mean, we have tons of boxes and whatever. And in that scenario, our internal goal is 2 minutes. A deploy cannot take more than 2 minutes, because that's about as long as I have for my personal patience before I'm off on Reddit somewhere. And then what was I doing? Oh shit, I had an 8-minute deploy cooking. I forgot all about that. Come back 2 hours later and I've completely lost my train of thought. 2 minutes to me, there's something magic about that limit. And we're going to try to push it all the way through with a minimum amount of complexity. But it is ongoing work too. I like that fact of essentially having, I don't want to say a roadmap, but treats in front of me. Like, ooh, we can get to that part over there too. That looks really tasty. Cursed be the man who solved all his problems. It is delightful to still have problems in front of you and things you can make better. This is one of the reasons why I am still here 20 years in. I legitimately had this naive notion back in 2005 or whatever. I don't know, how long? Like 9 months left? Then we're done. Then we've solved the web problem. Then there will be no more work to do. And at the time I thought, well, that sounds great. Then we can do something else. And now I'm more on the Karl Popper side of the equation, that you should be so lucky to find a problem that keeps yielding new problems, and be extra lucky if you happen to fall in love with that problem. And I have fallen in love with that problem. I've fallen in love with creating applications for the web. And lo and behold, the web keeps creating new problems. It keeps creating new opportunities and keeps putting out new invitations for us to do better, compress the complexity, all that good stuff. So that is what's keeping my attention focused. And I no longer think we're going to have it solved. There are individual parts of that we can solve. That I do like. For example, PropShaft is a good illustration of this. I put a bunch of time into creating PropShaft about a year and a half ago, I think. I did a sprint and I spent 2 weeks and it was all about PropShaft. And I've kind of barely thought about it since. We've done a couple of releases. There's a few things we tweaked. One thing we actually just released in PropShaft 1.1 that I pushed out, was it yesterday or the day before, was a way to reference Rails asset URLs inside of your JavaScript code, where you can get the digested version. If you're writing a stimulus controller and you need to reference an image, for example, you want the digested versions. Okay, great. We pushed that out. We have a fix for that. That's wonderful. But that little part can become a solved problem. I'm a big fan of finished software in that regard, but you cannot solve the web problem. That is just way too large. It will continue to yield new subproblems. And that's a delight. We should not look upon that with any degree of disappointment, but as a treasure trove of inspiration for us to continue to have fun programming.
You, again, with PropShaft, taken the sprocket, started to try to build everything, Sass, Less, all the different CSS things, JavaScript, CoffeeScript, and all that. And now it's, what if we just let you decide if you want to do that on your own? That was another one of the ones that earlier when you were talking about the 2-minute deploy, just thinking back to the days of waiting for Webpacker to compile. If Rails is already running and you've got some CPU and RAM being already allocated to that and you got to deploy and build it on the box, then you're pegged at 100% CPU. Ubuntu might kill your process trying to compile whatever in Webpacker. And it was just quite a different time. And then CSS and JS bundling were like, hey, and same with PropShaft. Hey, go for it. If you want to keep doing that, no problem. You just give us the result and we'll just handle that piece. And it's like the conceptual compression. It's so much easier to maintain those libraries too. You're not doing all the work for everything, for everyone, trying to support literally everything. You're like, what if we just let you plug yourself in here and we'll pick up from there? And that has been just spreading everywhere across. No longer needing Redis, for example, is a good one. I think Andrew was going to ask a question on that.
Yeah, selfishly, Nick Pezza taught me how to write Rails. So when I saw that, I was pretty excited on stage. But I just kind of wanted to ask about this move away from all these dependencies and how you kind of came across that library in general.
So the motivation for getting rid of all dependencies actually came from Once. So Once is our new approach to package software and sell it as a product instead of a service. Instead of signing up for a SaaS thing, you can buy, for example, an entire chat system, Campfire. What we use for well over 1,000 people at Rails World is a Once product. You can buy it for, I think we're charging $2.99 for it or $3.99, whatever. You buy it once, you get essentially sort of a Docker container for it. We've all wrapped it up nicely, but we wanted that to be accessible to someone with zero skill, not even programmer level skills of setup, but I know how to get WordPress running skills, maybe. That was the bar we were targeting. And I didn't want to actually explain how to set up all this stuff. We managed actually for that because partly that all the solid stuff wasn't ready. We shoved in Redis in a little bit clever way. I'll say that with both the positives and the negatives associated with that word. But going forward, I'd much rather that we have a completely dependency-free setup, especially since SQLite saves us from even having a database process. We can literally just have the Puma process, or at least the Puma process chain. We stick a thruster in front of it. But that's not something you need to know about. It's nothing you need to nurture. It's not something you need to maintain. There's no moving pieces. That's one of those metaphors for me that's so powerful. This idea that every single time you can reduce a moving piece, there's one piece less where the metal fatigue can set in. There's one piece less that needs to be oiled. There's one piece less where the gears can grind. And I think this is one of the things, for example, if you look at EV cars, an EV has less than 500 parts in most cases. A internal combustion engine car might have 4,000 parts, 5,000 parts. Once was trying to be an EV. Once was trying to how can we get an order of magnitude less complexity towards running your own software and running a Rails application, no less, running a web application, no less, on your own setup with as few moving pieces that needs oiling and constant tender love and care. So Redis was one of those things where, do you know what? I actually like Redis. Well, let me caveat that. I like the Redis sort of concept and idea. I'm not so keen on the literal Redis company as it exists today. I actually think that was one of those cautionary tales for the whole VC thing that we just talked about. This is what happens when millions of dollars are put into something. It has to yield. And the way sometimes that happens is not so pretty. This is one of the reasons I was excited to see Valkey at Rails World, that here's an alternative. Here's someone going like, you know what? Whatever Redis wants to do with their stuff, again, no shade on Anti-Res, that like, all right, he was done with that problem. And here's an opportunity for him to sell it to someone who's then going to try to commercialize it. I don't really have a problem with that. I would have a problem with it if there was no alternative. Someone wants to sign up for whatever that support contract is or hosted product or whatever, good for them. I just like to have the alternative. I don't have to need that. And we have Valkey now to do that in part. And that's great. But also great if this isn't even necessary. Certainly on day one through hopefully as long as possible. What are the kind of storage technologies that we can double down on and are now sufficiently powerful, efficient, whatever, that we can just take that entire category of complexity and move it out of the way? And I've really fallen in love with SQLite. We use SQLite for all the one stuff. That's the database there is. In fact, at the beginning, we were like, oh, maybe we should have an option. Maybe you could plug in your own MySQL database. Which is like, but why? SQLite is literally perfect for this problem. And I love that people are pushing it beyond that problem. But I think if I was doing single tenancy app development now, I wouldn't even look at any other database. It doesn't even make sense. Multi-tenancy, web scale, whatever. Okay, they're new problems and you need to solve those perhaps with different technology. But for the single tenancy stuff, which is exactly what once is, SQLite is just ideal. Which of course we know because SQLite is literally used in millions of applications, native applications, this, that, and the other thing. It hasn't been used as much for this kind of web stuff, or at least there's a rediscovery of how powerful it is. So anyway, getting rid of Redis doesn't actually mean getting rid of Redis. It's not like we're deprecating all these adapters that work with Redis or whatever. We just say, you know what? Wait until you need it, for sure. Don't introduce more moving parts unless you can't avoid them. And then when you do, be happy that there are well-tested adapters here and you can use those with Valkey or whatever. But you don't need Redis on day one.
The simplicity of removing those services that you have to restart if they crash and all that in production and just making it as easy as possible saves so much time. And it's the same thing as you don't have to use an authentication gem that might have some breaking changes anymore. You have Rails 8's authentication built in now, and you could mold it into what you need. Maybe you only want OAuth, go for it. You've got all the building blocks for it. While I've got you, I wanted to chat about the new exciting stuff that Rails 8.1 is heading towards. Search seemed to be the thing everybody was the most excited about because it is, as you're describing, one of the biggest pain points. Elasticsearch requires at least 4 gigs of RAM. I've had it straight up crash and won't even boot unless it had 4 gigs of RAM free for itself. Melee search and other things are great, but then you load your fixtures in the database, then you got to sync that over to the index and then keep all those separated and whatever. Love to have you chat about what you're thinking of. I assume these came from needing search in Campfire and Writebook and stuff. And so I'd love to hear what's coming.
And is it going to work for all the adapters? Because that's the biggest question I've been getting.
Yes. So the idea is absolutely that we are coming up with something of the same class as all the other Active Record stuff. I don't like, sometimes it's a compromise that you can lean on database specific features in Active Record. All right, you're fully wedded to Postgres. You can use whatever the JSON.
Yeah, PG search and
exactly.
Yeah.
And that to me is what you do when you have no other choice. But the first choice should be we make features, and Solid Q is a great example of that. We weren't so interested in just making a MySQL version of Good Job, for example. We wanted a solution that worked for all the 3 major engines. They all have their place. And we use MySQL at 37 Signals, and we have a bunch of operational tooling to be able to do that well. I know that Postgres is probably the most popular of the Rails databases. There are a lot of people who are very passionate about that. I love what they're doing over there in Postgres. I actually think If I could somehow unwind 20 years with MySQL, maybe I would have gone that direction. And again, exactly the same problem. What happened with MySQL? They took a bunch of money and then suddenly they had problems figuring out how to monetize that. And then Oracle bought them. I'd actually say I had way worse expectations for what would happen to MySQL after Oracle bought them. Now, I'm not celebrating yet. There's still time. Oracle can still screw this up, but I'd actually say they haven't. MySQL 8 is development that happened fully within Oracle's hands, and it's actually quite good. We continue to use it, and MySQL 8 was the enabler for high-performance solid queue in the same way that Good Job was able to use these Postgres features to be efficient about how to use a database as a job queue. And without that, you're not going to run the 20 million jobs a day as we do for Hay in an economical way. So it is a cautionary tale, but maybe one that had slightly better than expected outcomes. Wonderful in that regard. But I want to make sure we have all the options. Should Oracle tomorrow decide to really put on their pointy devil hat ears, we can go, do you know what? Postgres exists. It's going to be a bit of a slog to migrate all our stuff now out, but it's possible. And why is it possible? Because we use Active Record. Wouldn't even begin to contemplate it if we had all wedded all our stuff directly to one specific database engine. This is what abstraction provides you. This is what the adapter pattern gives you. Freedom of migration, freedom of movement. And maybe there's a couple of things you got to unwind, but they're going to be the minority issues. So we're going to do that with search as well. We're still working on it. We're going to start from the quote unquote low end. We're going to start from the work we're doing on Once with single tenancy apps. There's less of a performance overhead requirement. I mean, Elasticsearch is built for essentially web scale. It is quite cumbersome to operate, but you can operate it for Shopify, for GitHub. You can use it at that scale and it's doable. That's not where we're going to start because I think it kind of feels like Elasticsearch, for example, is the way it is because that was the target audience out the gate. And then a bunch of people who have far less modest problems have adopted the same solution and they're dealing with all the complexity that comes from being able to go to web scale. Now, sometimes in very rare circumstances, perhaps there's overlap and it doesn't matter that much. Elasticsearch is not one of those things. It is, as you say, cumbersome at best to set up, to operate. In fact, we just had this problem you were talking about. We had switched all our storage dependencies, MySQL, Redis, Elasticsearch to run in Docker. And that was just a better way of setting up rather than installing Elasticsearch straight on your machine. It just breaks all the time. And then I think the default settings was just letting that Docker container use as much memory as it wanted to or something. And we just had a bunch of developers literally run out of RAM on their machine because Elasticsearch just wanted all of it. And we had to tweak the settings to allow that. So Active Record Search is intended at first to solve sort of the 1 to 0 problems, right? And many of the same approaches that we did with Solid Cable, for example. Maybe there's a time where Solid Cable is not going to scale to Shopify levels of traffic and you need Redis or whatever. But let's start here. Let's solve the problem. Let's get the API correct. Let's get the setup experience correct. And I think by now, we already have a playbook. The solid line of adapters give us the playbook for adding additional databases that run with their own schema. They're separated and isolated. They're easy to plug in and plug out. We could do something similar with Active Record Search. But also, we're not running it. Well, we're sort of running it inside of one of the new Once apps that we're making, but we're not running it in production. There's still a bunch of work to be done. Just this morning, before hopping on this call, I had a good session reviewing Jorge's PR for the API. I really want the API to be just as simple as can be, because this is one of the reasons I don't enjoy Elasticsearch very much, because I just find it very cumbersome to set up. It's not even just the operation of the underlying engine. It's the integration, how you map the setup of the indexes and so on. Whenever I get to that stage in projects I'm working on, I'm like, yeah, it's time I'm tapping out here. On Hay, we had a guy, Pratik, who had done this before. I would tap him in and go, can you come in and do this? I can't be bothered trying to shove all the Elasticsearch knowledge into my limited brain budget up here. I need that just to be. So that's what I'm hoping. I am hoping that with that active record search, we will get to the point where I don't need to tap anyone. I'll just, has searchable or whatever we end up the syntax being. It'll be so simple that I don't need to hand it off, and that it won't be a great conceptual monster for someone to try to wrestle with when they just need some basic search. And this is the other thing. Elasticsearch is, in some ways, like Caddy, like Traffic, a Swiss Army knife that can span the entire realm of it. And it can do so many things. And we use so little of it. The API footprint that we use in our apps, even at the scale of Basecamp, even at the scale of Hey, is like ye big. There's not very much of it. And this is where I find it's not proportionate. And I want to start with a clean sheet of paper. I want to see what we actually cannot do without. That's the stuff we'll end up implementing. And then other people can add their stuff into it and whatever. But if we just start with that, I'm certain we're going to end up with a solution that's 1,000 times simpler. It'll do 1,000 times less, but if it does just the things that we need, that 1,000x simplification is going to pay off some huge dividends in learnability, setup, operations, all the things.
The internet's evolved over time, but search is like a de facto, like we can't build an app without search anymore. Probably have to always have search for some level, but we're not building DuckDuckGo where search is the business. We're building all these products that I want to search through the campfire history. And if I get a match, I get a match. And maybe you hit the match on the title of a message in Basecamp. And that's more priority than
we have all
the
that.
same word. And
We have weights, we have stemming, we have prefixing. I think that's the other thing that's so nice about having used Elasticsearch for 15 years. It trained us on the problem. We know what we need. We know how to use it. I know, for example, that idea of getting relevancy is a complete white elephant for us. We're never going to be able to have whatever the input to the scales for that to be useful. We've tried to get relevancy to work for a long time. We tried to get it for Hey, we've tried to get it work for Basecamp. And we realized, you know what? I think you need Google scale for that to somehow spit out the correct result. If you're literally looking at the internet, you can't just use recency. You got to have relevancy. And that's the problem space where that makes sense. You're looking inside your own Basecamp account? No, recency is a much better order than relevancy, because relevancy is going to be this weird magic box where you don't know why things are being elevated. But you can still do things with weights. You can make sure that the title is more important. Like, for example, if I'm searching for an email in Hey, yes, the subject of an email, if there's a direct match, should count more than seeing this word inside the body of the email. And those are exactly the kind of levers that we're building into active record search, because it has to be a real alternative. It can't just be like, it's got search. Yeah, if you accept that it doesn't do anything, right? Like if it's just like a where like percentage term percentage. Yeah. Okay, that's search.
Technically, yeah.
Use that. That was the first search that Basecamp has was exactly that SQL query. Where, like, whatever, right? And that gives you a little bit, but it's not an alternative to Elasticsearch. So for us, for active record search to be an alternative, for the user, it has to be invisible or near damn invisible. They have to be not able to tell whether I'm using one thing or another thing.
And this goes back a little bit to the difference between Rails as an extracted framework out of products you're building versus if Rails was a company, the product would have to be, if we're launching search, it has to support every kind of possible search. If you search for Rails, we have to know the context of, are you talking about programming, trains, whatever, and cocaine, whatever it is? I don't know. And that's stuff that
association, trains, and then like the third one was cocaine.
But I think we get so much more useful things out of this because of that approach, where it's immediately focused and it's not trying to solve every problem ever. And that might be frustrating if somebody is trying to shoehorn it into a different problem that it wasn't really meant to be solving. But that is part of the this is how things work. We've already used this to build products. It works great. It makes millions of dollars and is tried and true and whatever. So Markdown, I think, was the other House MD, and Action Notifier, I believe, were the other two things you mentioned for Rails 8.1. Do you have time to chat about those briefly? And
yeah, I can give a just brief overview of how they came to be. Action Notifier, I actually really wanted Action Notifier in Rails 8.0, but at some point,
yeah, remember that
is bigger than what you can fit the time to do, and that was the case there. So that's why that got bumped, because Action Notifier exists. We're running it. If you were at Rails World and you ran the PWA for Campfire and you were getting your little push notifications, that was Action Notifier. It was running through actually the code on the slides I had during my keynote. That's the code. If you have bought Campfire, you can open it up and you can see Action Notifiers in there. We didn't use it for Writebook, but in Campfire, that's in there. It just, quote unquote, just needs to be extracted, polished up, separated from the Campfire code base. And I love that project because it brings us one huge step closer to having PWAs be the default for new applications that need a native component or a native mobile component. Well, native. It needs a mobile component. Because for a lot of native mobile apps that are companion apps to mainly web applications, the key feature they provide is push notifications. That was the thing we had a hard time getting before. And with Action Notifier, we take advantage of a service worker setup that is a little finicky to get right. I'll say this is one of the reasons I really want to make it a framework, because I worked on this problem in Campfire for a while and I spent days just trying to get that service worker just right. It's amazing what service workers can do, but they're also not very ergonomic. They're not very easy to work with. They're not very easy to reason about. And I would like to just solve this problem once and have service workers be something that enables me to do things, not something I need to write all the time. I don't want to write my own service workers. I just want to get some of the features that it allows. And Action Notifier does that for web push. And web push makes it more rare that you need to reach for a full native application. If you do, now we just launched Hotwire Native. There was so much stuff I couldn't even shove it all into my keynote. And the Hotwire Native stuff literally only got done the day before. That's the only reason it didn't feature more prominently in my keynote. But I want to have the whole ramp, right? We start from the floor and then we go up. And as you start, it should be possible to have a Campfire style PWA that does push notifications, and you barely know how this works. And then you move up and then, I need a little more. I need a little more. I need a little more. I need some native stuff now. All right, let me move to Hotwire Native. And now I can build some of these stuff into it. But that's what it is. It's not a huge framework. And it could be a lot of things. And it also does exist already. I think, Chris, you worked on something in this realm too, with notifications. And there are many different ways to slice this. You could marry it to emails. You could marry it to in-app notifications too. We've tried that as well. We have that in, I think it's Hey or Campfire. We have a thing that does multiple things at the same time. And I will say, I have reservations about how that overlap works out. I find that it's often on different timelines and scales. When do I want to send an email versus when do I want to send a push notification? It's not always just like for like. It's just a medium. They're also quite different in the shape they take. The emails are usually longer. They can have more things in it. You can use them for different kinds of things. The push notifications work really well for, hey, you have a new DM or something like that. It doesn't work so well for, I don't know, other things where you need to, or like you have a billing notification or something. And let that be an email. Like send me the invoice on the email, whatever. So I think that's one of the reasons why I just wanted to keep Action Notifier just for web push. And then we can have these other things. We have Action Mailer. There are other notification frameworks that can try to do other things, but the Action Notifier will be as simple as possible. And I'm trying hard to resist the temptation to make it multi-link. That's one thing, because then it can be really small. It can be easy to understand. It could be all the other good things we get from that.
That's what I tried to tackle in the Notice Gem, which was you write a notifier class and you say it's delivered by default. It's delivered to the database. The problem becomes if you want to send a notification to 10,000 people, then we have to write one event and then have 10,000 recipients. Every one of those has to have a read at timestamp and yada, yada, other metadata. And then, like you were saying, if it's a Twilio SMS, it can only be this long. If it's an email, then we'll forward it off to Action Mailer and give it the context it needs. But then you also have to be careful to associate. If it's a chat message, if that message is deleted, we need to make sure we delete the associated notifications because there could be multiple. And it is a can of worms that it'd be great if someone's working on it. It does not seem like a great feature to have in the framework, knowing the amount of time I put into it. This is a giant project. Everybody wants to use it totally differently. And it feels a lot like the search problem, just like one of those.
Authentication problem.
Exactly.
I think we have a lot of these kinds of problems in web development that have high levels of intrinsic complexity. I get very excited when I see a problem that's just all accidental complexity. That's what I feel about deployment, for example. That's what I feel about Kamal. Oh, there's so much accidental complexity here. There's all these traffic labels. We can get rid of them without costing you any functionality at all. But when it comes to notifications, you care. When it comes to authentication, you care because these are all user-facing level. I originally had this dividing line for what belongs in Rails and what doesn't belong in Rails. And the dividing line was essentially whether the user could see it, whether you could make any type of app happen on top of it, or it would feel like it was this type of app. When you use device, it's great. It is essentially that, trying to solve a problem with a lot of different tentacles in it. Then you encroach on the user experience, which in some circumstances, that's fine. You're building something you don't really care. I don't care what the login screen looks like. I don't care what the password reset flow feels like. Great. It doesn't belong in Rails proper because I care about all those things. And I don't want Hey to feel like a generic Rails app. You should have to look very, very detailed, usually at headers in HTTP responses to even know that this is a Rails app. Maybe you get a clue, oh, this URL is slug, maybe smells Rails, but I've been fooled by that before. Then I go into the headers and go like, oh, they use Python or something. I go look for things like, I don't know if anyone else is using the X request ID exactly in that format. Usually that one I look for, or X runtime. I think maybe X runtime has been adopted by others, so maybe I can't use that as a telltale anymore. But this ethos that Rails is a toolkit for creating any type of Rails or web application, and you will not be able to tell, and you can have a completely bespoke user flow and user experience and design is sacred. We're not going to violate that. We can build on top of it. This is why I'm really happy that something like device exists. And I could totally imagine that someone builds a device-like, or what you're doing with your notification setup, that builds on top of Action Mailer and on top of Action Notifier. And then you can be more prescriptive in how it all works, because at that level, there will be people who'll be like, I just don't care. Can you just solve this entire problem for me? I don't care if you also design my user-facing templates. Yet, we can collaborate why I care, and I have my bespoke flow, and you can't tell in that regard. So I think that's still a good dividing line for what belongs in Rails proper versus what belongs as a gem you can use with Rails.
I like that distinction a lot. However, HouseMD and Tricks are the front-end things, which I'm super excited about. Is that going to use the same storage and action text on the back end? We can more or less kind of swap out the front end, I guess.
That's the hope. And actually, that's a great example because it dances right on the fine line. And it's actually one of the reasons in Rails 8, we've changed how the style sheets are generated. So the style sheets for Tricks used to live inside the gem, and you had to kind of dig a bit if you wanted to overwrite them. And I think that's wrong because that actually is a telltale sign. That toolbar was designed by a designer at 37 Signals, and it has a style. And if you just plug in that in there, like, it looks a little bit, lots of people perhaps will be okay. It's very subtle. It was designed to be very anonymous, but I want it to be even more obvious. How do you change that? How do you make it your own? So when you install action text now in your app, when you do Rails action _text : install, it'll copy over the entire Tricks style sheet. So it'll have all the declarations for how does this button look? What are we referencing here for this icon? And you can change all of it. It's quite easy to do. But to your question, House MD, I don't know if we're going to stick the MD in there. I just think it was funny. That's how the name came.
Really funny. It's really funny.
It was great.
Because it was one of those things where like we needed a name for it. And I always loved that TV show, House MD. And we're going to do exactly what you say. It should be a drop-in replacement for tricks, and it should work with action text in all the ways action text already integrate with active storage. So you should be able to have images in there and so forth. We still have some work to do on that, but if you use Writebook, for example, Writebook uses HouseMD, and you can drag files in there, and that's a good illustration of how it would work. That's why I also used the screenshot in the keynote from that. And I want to make it seamless. What will not be seamless necessarily is you can't quite jump back and forth, because if you have something that's written with tricks, it's not going to always map directly. Maybe someone can write a converter and then we can do it. But I think it's one where you pick this project, I'm going to use HouseMD, at least at the outset. But I am very excited about having Markdown be an option for more people and make it feel like it's a little more end user possible. I mean, you could use Markdown right now. It's not like anyone's holding you back, but a little bit of flair, a little bit of hash font actually makes the headline bigger. And if you do two of them, it's going to be turned into an H2, and that's going to look kind of nice. I want it to feel like Writebook feels. It should be totally easy to have a Writebook-like text editor in your own Rails app if you're designing something for the kind of people who would enjoy Markdown versus a WYSIWYG editor. I really enjoy Markdown. I do all my note-taking now after I switched to Linux in this thing called Obsidian. And one of my favorite things about Obsidian is the fact that it's just text files. It's just Markdown files. I actually just point Obsidian to my Dropbox. I already pay for Dropbox. That's where I store all my files. And the fact that there's no format, it doesn't have a database I have to disentangle. Do you know what? If Obsidian raises venture capital tomorrow and in 18 months is this monstrosity that's twisting my arm to buy their synchronization service or whatever, I can go like, well, thanks for all the fish. And I'm going to take my little Markdown files and I'm going to go somewhere else. I can use it in NeoVim and I will not feel locked in. I love that. And that's why I like to see more Markdown. I like to see more of that, making exports be more usable. If you, for example, could think you're building to even a Basecamp, right? Like we export right now and the export comes out in HTML, but it's styled HTML and you can open those pages and that's great. But I also like the idea that you have a bunch of documents in Basecamp and you hit export and you just get Markdown files. That's pretty cool. The same thing for Writebook. If you want to get all the content you've written in Writebook out of it, it'd be very nice for us to just give you the Markdown files. And you can take them anywhere. You can shove them into Obsidian or wherever you want to store them. These basic, simple, independence allowing file formats, I think, are just so important in a way that we are so easy to forget, so easy to get enamored by some new note-taking app, whatever. And then we're like, oh, this is great. And then you don't think, yeah, but what happens if in a year from now, I don't really like it? How do I get out again? Of course, in the commercial world, they don't want you to get out again. That's half the point here. So there's some incentives that are not super duper well aligned. Again, this goes to our discussion about venture capital. This is one of the reasons why sometimes when that funding model is applied to open source, you end up with some of this where like, what if we just made a few features you kind of had to use our cloud for? I think the whole Vercel Next.js thing has a lot of that. It is just ever so tempting to put in just a little bit of friction that if you don't use our commercial process, it's just cumbersome or maybe even not possible. Like it becomes an upsell. That's one of the key reasons I never, ever want any of that stuff to touch Rails. I'm revolted by the idea that we would upsell some features in Rails. Oh, Rails is really great. But if you want the new rate limiting feature, it's going to be... No. That stuff should be built on top of it. There's a thriving industry of jumpstart kits, whatever. That's great. Someone could take 4 components here and then they could build something on top of it and then it could turn that into sort of their specific bespoke version that gets people started. I love that. This doesn't come from some aversion to commerce. I sell software for fucking living. That's how I made all my money. I like capitalism. I also like for open source to exist kind of adjacent, but not inside of it. And we're going to continue to do that. So this goes through file formats, it goes through logins, it goes through features, it goes through all of it and permeates all of it. And I think this is why Rails in some ways is going to end up perhaps even more with a unique profile, because we've chosen just a different path on that question.
Yeah, it feels like every other framework is GitHub sponsors isn't a great option. People just don't want to donate to fund things. And the cool part about Rails is that you've already built Basecamp and Hey and a business. And so this is sustainable in a way that most other frameworks are not. Going back to Markdown, are we going to have it generating the HTML server side? Are we going to have a microservice that generates the HTML for us?
No, we are going to have what we have in Writebook right now, where we have some client-side stuff to do sort of the light styling. So you get some clues when you're doing it. But I think for me, the big thing about Markdown is that it's not WYSIWYG. You still see the Markdown. You still see the formatting thing. So you're doing italics, you're still going to see the underscores. It's just also going to be italic to give you a hint of how you're styling it. But you're going to need to process it. And in my opinion, you should just process it server side. I've seen some Markdown editors that essentially have the split view. You're writing over here and it's generating something live over there. You can totally do that in Rails. The latency is well low enough that you can do that. But I want to make sure, again, that this whole Markdown path should actually feel simpler than the WYSIWYG path. Like there should be less to it. You should actually be able to, I was going to say, almost use it without the client side flourishes of whatever. Just this whole idea that, hey, here's a record and it's going to have a content blob, and that content blob is going to be automatically wired up with active storage. All of those nice things. That's the bulk of the advantage, I think. Well, we'll see how it goes. We haven't wrapped it all yet. We haven't even come up with the final API for how to do all the integration. We have it in Writebook and people can have a look at it there. But there's still some work and some polish to go into it. So this is why it's a little overpromising to necessarily say 8.1. I don't know when 8.1 is going to drop. I don't know when all this is going to be ready. This is aspirational declaration. Again, in part, there's no fucking BC to hold us to it. We can blow our roadmap. We can take longer if it needs to take longer. We can send it back to the kitchen if the framework isn't ready yet, and we can just ship something else or not at all or take a break. You have options in a different way when it's all just a gift exchange. I'm not asking you for any money. I'm asking you at most for some gratitude, and that's not even a requirement for receiving these gifts. I'm just asking you not to be a belligerent customer, because I'm not selling you anything. You're not buying my time. You're not buying my priorities. You're not buying a roadmap from me. You are getting a gift, not just from me, but from everyone working on this framework. As I've said, you can either say thank you or at least shut up if that's what it is. I mean, you can also offer constructive feedback. That's great. And bug reports, those are also wonderful. And contributions, they're also great. And criticism is also fine. But we don't have a vendor relationship. I'm not your IBM. I'm not your Vercel. I'm not selling you something that has a hotline where you can file help tickets. There's no phone number on the back. As Matt said when we were chatting like at the Shopify pregame, he loves the MIT license for one reason primarily, and it says in capital letters, no warranty. No warranty implied, no warranty offered, no warranty available. You are getting a gift, and if it works for you, I am ever so stoked. And if it doesn't, hopefully you'll help get it there and contribute to it. And if it really doesn't, there's about 1 million other options you could choose.
And it's also a really, I'd say this out of just trying to help the community. It gives people in the community space to go contribute, because otherwise, if it's not from the official company, it's not really welcome, it feels a lot of times. And that gives us so much opportunity ourselves to get involved and contribute and build things and explore ideas and whatnot that I hugely appreciate. And I'm so glad that our community is set up the way that it is.
This is why when I was talking to Matt on stage with Toby, I was so smitten with this idea that Matt has designed Ruby in such a way that allows me to finish his sentences in his style, and you won't be able to tell the difference. Ruby does not discriminate towards the language extensions that exist in our dialect with active support and the things that are native to the language. And that is an incredible vote of confidence to your users that you allow them to operate at that level. I want Rails to feel the same way. I want someone to be able to design their dialect for Rails and make it feel like they're completing the Rails sentences in a way that doesn't feel like they're discriminated a bunch. And we sometimes have this discussion in the community, right? What goes into core? When does it go in there? And sometimes I'm a little surprised by that discussion because I never feel that way about Ruby. I don't sit around waiting for Mats to put my favorite extensions to string into the Ruby language. I can just put them into active support. And then I get to use them as though Mats had designed them. Where is it in the Rails world that that's not true? If we have blockers, we should fix those. We should get closer to the Ruby ideal, I think. But maybe some of those blockers are also mental. That there's some sense that if I'm working on an extension or a dialect, unless it's in the main core of it, it's not validated or appreciated. I'm not sure exactly what it is, but I wish we would move a little beyond that and accept the fact that Rails core is never going to have all your hopes and dreams. You're going to want to live out those dreams in your own gems. Ruby Gems is full of gems and extensions and what have you to it. Again, I can see the advantages and I can see the satisfaction of seeing something you've worked on, make it to some stage or another. I've always smiled when I've seen Ruby draw inspiration from some active support method and go like, oh, that's great. That's great. I'm glad they also liked it and put it in there. But if they don't, so no skin off my back. So let's get there with Rails, that Rails is a big enough tent that you can do that. And I think in some ways that has always happened. RSpec, to me, is my favorite example. I've never been a fan of RSpec. I've never been a silent critic of RSpec. I've been quite vocal about the fact that, you know what, that's not the API design I enjoy. Now, I understand I've come to understand, I should say. I did not understand in the beginning. I've come to understand there are other reasons why people use RSpec. They like its runner, they like other things. It's not always about the API design, the part that I have quite some trouble with. But also, who cares what I think in many ways? You can use RSpec with your project, and it's great. It works wonders. And plenty of Rails apps, their entire test suite is in RSpec. Great, wonderful. I'm so glad that you found a way to express your preferences through a dialect. We should encourage more of that. It should not be seen as a demotion, a lack of a promotion, whatever, that something exists in that realm. We have different priorities and different goals. Exactly as we were talking about this waterline, where what I want in Rails, it has to enable any type of application outside of that. We cannot veer too far into full styling. This is one of the reasons, for example, that I've resisted the temptation for many years to make scaffolding beautiful. I don't want the scaffolding to be beautiful in its default configuration. I want it to be ugly because I want you to write your own. Well, not necessarily the scaffolding, but I want you to have your own design, bring your own design. Let's not end up with a bunch of Rails applications that all look alike. This is one of the reasons I sometimes have mixed feelings about these component networks or component setups. I totally get the productivity boost that you can go, oh yeah, I just pick a date picker from here, I pick this thing from here, and then I get something done very quickly. And maybe the thing I'm working on does not warrant or cannot afford a bespoke design. And I get it, but I also don't like it, really. I don't want the whole web to look uniform. So I'm still wrestling with that. I can see the positives of it. I can also see the homogenization of the internet in a way that I don't quite enjoy. It's kind of like this, what do they call it? The worldwide Instagram aesthetic. You walk into any coffee shop in Sydney to San Francisco to LA, and like they all have the same quirky, exposed driftwood bullshit and light bulbs that looks like they're from the 50s and all that stuff. At some point, it actually becomes offensive that it has that uniformity to it, and it just becomes not what I want to encourage more of. So I'm still trying to work through how could we have the best of both worlds? Could there be some Duplo blocks that you do insert, but it doesn't dictate how the whole thing looks? I'm not entirely sure, but that's part of the reasons why scaffold by default is still butt ugly. It is ugly by design. And we've laxed that a little bit, right? If you include Tailwind as your CSS generator, you actually do get a rather nice looking, or at least nicer looking scaffolding. So I want to have my cake and eat it too. I want to have all the things. I want to have that it's easy and it looks good. And I also want to encourage that people don't end up with the same exact aesthetic for everything on the internet. So still a problem to wrestle with. This is what we said about the web problems never solved. I think component libraries are on the rise. People are seeing the advantages of it. And I like that. I like the new challenge. I like how can we take that and spin it in a way where it feels like it's Rails compatible. But we'll see.
Yeah. I think the biggest time savings for that stuff that I see is because I feel the same. I don't want to pull in Bootstrap like everybody else, where undoing the button styles is actually kind of a pain in the ass. And you see every app, the alerts and the buttons. The rest of the app might look different, but those things are always the same. The one thing that I do think would be incredibly useful is the developer experience around building your stimulus components. If it could help with ARIA attributes and those other accessibility keyboard shortcuts, that type of thing, where it's almost like Adam's got headless UI for Tailwind, which is basically unstyled UI components for modals or tabs or whatever that have that stuff wired up, which is something that I don't really have a lot of interest reading all the W3C docs and everything for that. If we could have something that was, because right now, the way I was describing it at Rails World to a couple of people is Stimulus is awesome because it gives you the organization that jQuery never really did and just makes that way easier, but it doesn't give you conceptual abstraction for components yet. And that would be really cool. I think that would help a lot with, I need a modal. Browsers are getting pretty darn good about some of these things, but hopovers still can't style them the way that you want. They can't be placed relative to the thing. And that maybe is just, let's wait until browsers support that. And then that could be easy or whatever. But it's
explore this. I want to continue. For many years since I originally designed Stimulus during the Christmas break of whatever, 18, 17. I sat there on a Christmas break. We were at parents-in-law for a few days. And it was just, you know what? I don't like how our JavaScript is organized. In Basecamp, it's all over the place. We have 3 different styles. Don't like it at all. I came up with essentially the Stimulus API style and how to structure these things. Right from that moment, we should have a standard library. There should be a standard library for Stimulus. So I still want to pursue that. I've found that it's not actually quite as easy, perhaps, as I hoped it would be. Maybe the missing component is to be more prescriptive about the HTML it works with or whatnot. I think there's something to do here. And I do like the approach that, is it Shad CDN, or I always forget how to pronounce that.
Shad CN.
It's a copy-paste component network rather than black box component network, like Bootstrap and those earlier styles. There's something there. I mean, this is also the same approach we're following with the authentication generator. There's no black box. The authentication generator in Rails 8 will give you all the code because I want you to actually understand it. I don't want to compress that complexity. It's right at the surface. And we've compressed the complexity in has secure password and the token generator.
Authenticate by.
Okay, you don't need to worry about that, but you should actually understand that level of it. I'd like to get there with components as well at some point, that we have something that we can copy paste. And this is one of the reasons I really like Tailwind. I think the idea that you can do a copy and paste and the styles come with is a super powerful paradigm that I'm still wrestling with. How do we do that? How could we do that at 37 Signals? We don't have a, what do they call them? Design framework or design
system or whatever.
A design system. That's what they're called. We don't have a design system. We don't have a component library. And one of the reasons is we don't even want 2 of our apps to look the same. We want Campfire to feel bespoke from Hey to feel bespoke from Rightboard. And I think this is something a lot of people are going to get a kick out with the new apps. I mean, we've gone way beyond. With the 2 new things we're working on, I'm like, holy shit, I didn't even know web apps could look like this. They are the refutation of component design. They just look, I was about to say spacey. Does that sound like it's an LSD trip thing? It's not that at all. It's novel. It is very novel design that comes from the fact that we have some very talented designers who work with the native elements of the web. And if I'd just given them a box of Tailwind components, our shit wasn't going to look like that. That's not
right.
We'll do with Tailwind. It's not even Tailwind. Let's take Tailwind out of the equation. Component frameworks, design systems. That would have generated the same uniformity. We would have gotten the same, what is the style now? Black background with some purple fade thing, right? That literally everything seems to have, right? That's what everything looks like. And it is, again, that same Instagram aesthetic we're talking about for cafes. It's not that the aesthetic itself is ugly. It's actually quite good. That look, the black with there's some of that right here. Some of that right here, like some purple fade. Like, it's pretty cool until everyone fucking uses it for everything all the time. Then it becomes worn out really quickly. And then we get a uniform web that just is unappealing and actually offensive aesthetically. So anyway, that still gets to the point. I think there's an open question here. I want to, personally, I'm just interested in the problem. I always think, what would I do if I'm starting over tomorrow and it's just me? Do you know what? I'm not going to come up with the totally novel design that our crack design team at 37 Signals is going to do. I don't have those skills. I don't have that creativity. I need a little bit of that, whatever, bland aesthetic that's at least not butt ugly, offensive ugly. Like, there's just baseline bland. And I want to make sure that Rails has that, because not all applications are going to strive for artisan bespoke designs. A lot of applications that Rails are used for, especially internal applications, people don't care. They just want something fast and cheap. And that has a place too, as long as we don't cheapen the whole web. That's the fine line. That's the fine line. We got to make sure that, like, there are moments where this thing would not exist unless I just slammed a bunch of components together. And that was what made it possible. Okay, fine. But then also, got to have a higher aspiration for the rest of the web.
Yeah. It almost brings us back to the venue choices at Rails World. You want to purposefully think about those things because it affects how you feel about the product that you're building on the web, all those little
Aesthetics
details.
Matter.
Yeah.
Aesthetics just really matter.
One really
to that concept in Ruby on Rails, because Ruby is the most aesthetically pleasing programming language that has literally ever been invented. And I don't say that to, like, sort of battle someone on it. I actually consider that to be an objective truth. But that's not what everyone wants necessarily. But I think most programmers, even if they don't really even want Ruby, maybe they don't even like it. Maybe they don't even like how it looks, right? Like, maybe they don't actually agree that it's a very aesthetically pleasing. They're happy it exists. That's what I want, right? Like, I'm very happy that, I don't know, Elixir exists. I don't want to write that style of code, but I'm really happy that exists. I think it's really novel. I think they've taken some great principles and put them together and made them more appealing to people. I look at that and I smile. I'm like, that's what the web is. Man, isn't that cool? Someone can dig Erlang out of obscurity, whatever. Maybe that's offensive. I don't know. But bring it to a new audience. And now this is an option too. Awesome. I wish someone would do that again for Smalltalk, for example. I mean, I know there were some, what was it called? Seaside. That was one of the early Smalltalk web frameworks that Avi Bryant worked on, who was also a Rubyist. And I always looked at that and like, oh, that's so fucking cool. I love that the web allows us to do all of that. I want more of it because I want the inspiration from it. I want to be able to look at everything from Elixir to Smalltalk to whatever and go like, ooh, that little part, I could borrow that. I know lots of frameworks and languages have done that with Ruby on Rails. I see it all the time. I see like, ooh, that's a Rubyism. Well, that's a Railsism that was borrowed. And I smile and go like, that's great.
Yeah, and it's a testament to the language and how it was used, because even to this day, if you hear all the people complaining about how slow Rails is, yet they're still copying the style of code and all of that. Well, you're trying to have your cake and eat it too kind of thing or whatever. Oh, we don't appreciate how you could do it way faster in Go, but yet this language is very descriptive and very well done. One of my favorite things is just, I was telling several people about the authentication generator. Typically in Devise or most of the other ones, you have to tell it in application controller to authenticate everything and then break out of that, which is easier to make mistakes and accidentally expose something. But the Rails authentication generator does the opposite. And then you could have just left it. You have to put in your own skip before action. But yet you gave it a class method, you gave it a name. And when I read it, I just get to see allow unauthenticated access. It's actually pretty long for a method name that gets my attention. And it's all these little ergonomics that make a huge difference.
Yes. I love that. I remember coming up with that and going like, ooh, I like how long it is. I like the fact that that really calls attention to itself. It's this idea we actually discussed during the Rails Core offsite meeting before the conference. We were talking about strict locals in partials. And the fact that I don't like it. I don't like it at all.
Yeah.
And it kind of snuck in because I wasn't paying attention, and that's on me. And if I could unwind, it wouldn't have gone in the way it did. And I got the full backstory from the people at Shopify and Jean and John who worked on this problem. And I came to understand, they're actually not trying to inject statically typed partials, even though that's what a lot of people saw and got excited about it. Like, no, dude, you got the wrong idea. That's not what we do here. They wanted it for performance reasons, for optimizations reasons, for the partial lookups and so on. And a bunch of that made a lot more sense. And when I heard some of the performance statistics, for example, at GitHub and how much time is being spent on and where they found it in the profile and what, it all made sense. But it's also one of those things where we were talking about ways to make it uglier, not prettier, not easier to use, uglier, because it needed some syntactic vinegar. Not syntactic sugar. We have a lot of syntactic sugar. We want you to use these methods this way. We make it deliciously aesthetically pleasing to do so. And then occasionally you do not want someone to use a certain feature unless they really super duper need it and know exactly what they're doing. So you make it ugly. So you make it undesirable to have as just part of your code base. I want to make strict locals uglier. We're already working on the documentation side of it. I think this came across and got some folks who naturally lean towards statically typing excited for the wrong reasons. They thought that this was where we were going to move, that we're going to start sorbetting everything. No, we're not. And I want to make that clearer. And I think syntactic vinegar, really thinking about, am I trying to make this ergonomic, really easy to hold, or am I actually trying to put it behind some, only break this glass in case of emergency? And strict local to me should be behind the glass of only breaking case of emergency. Only if you are GitHub, Shopify, or someone else who can literally see like, we could save $400,000 a year if whatever the partial lookup was slightly more efficient.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense at that scale. And one of those things that, okay, we will accept this as a thing because of that reason that, yes, we're not trying to make Rails slow ever. Right. That's never the point. But there's dragons here. So if you want to, go for it, but you got to be ready for that.
And we also have to accept, I've accepted it since the beginning, we have to communicate to everyone else looking at this that Ruby on Rails is the kind of environment where we will occasionally choose aesthetics over, not even occasionally, most of the time, choose aesthetics over runtime performance. Almost all the time, it does not matter because whatever the aesthetic considerations, they're not your hot spot. Then there are a handful of hotspots. Some of them are shared across all Rails applications. There we can go like, you know what? On this part of the internals, we're going to write code that's a little ugly because it just lives right in this hot loop and it shows up on all the flame charts and whatever. We will trade away the aesthetics for runtime performance because it is a hotspot. And that's the exception. And we will do that only when forced. Our default posture will be, we will make the prettiest damn code that is possible to write. And then we will find a way to make that fast first without having any consequences to its aesthetics. And only as an absolute last resort will we make something more cumbersome or more ugly in service of performance or memory overhead or whatever. And I think this is where we are so uniquely blessed in the Ruby on Rails ecosystem that we have a ton of company who are sitting on the frontier of major mega scale problems. You have a Shopify that's literally responsible for 10 to 20% of e-commerce in the world. There's just such an enormous scale that they have to solve some problems that are frontier problems. And all that stuff can trickle down to us mere mortals who are not dealing with literal web scale problems. And yet at the same time, the entire framework is not just driven by that objective. It's not just driven by what's best for the runtime performance of an app that runs 20% of e-commerce in the world. We're optimizing and we're being explicit about the fact this is a one developer framework. We're optimizing for conceptual compression. We're optimizing for all of these other things too. And somehow, to a large degree, we're able to have our cake and eat it too. We're able to have GitHub, Shopify on main. I'm sometimes feeling like, shit, I got to make sure Basecamp is up to date here. How the hell are they on a more recent version of Rails over there? And they're a huge shop literally running so much volume through main on the bleeding edge. We used to call it the bleeding edge because you get cut every other day. They're in production with it. And that's actually why we no longer have a bleeding edge. We have an edge, but it's not bleeding. You won't cut your thumb off. And we're able to push out releases like the Rails 8. We called it a beta just because, you know what? That's a nice thing to do. We could just slap down final straight to it. We'd already been running Rails 8 for months and months on all these top tier applications. And that's pretty incredible. It's not that often you end up with an ecosystem like this where you both have access to that peak web scale, that those improvements trickle down, benefit us all. And you also get to optimize for the other end. Usually it gets captured by one end or another. Either that we just don't have those kind of properties, we don't have those kind of size apps, and we deal with different kinds of problems. And then anyone who are getting there, they run into trouble maybe a little quickly. That's where Rails used to be. If you wound the clock back to 2008, you had a bunch of these apps who were starting to get traction, who all had to solve sort of frontier problems all the time. Now the frontier is, do you run 20% of e-commerce on the internet? If not, you know what? Most of your problems will probably have been sorted. There might be some small hiccups along the way, but you know you can take it all the way forward. While I have this obsession with the idea that I'm starting over from scratch, just me, I have to be able to do everything myself, right? Not like, oh, what would I do if I had 3,000 programmers at my disposal and then I started over? So I love the tension, and sometimes there is tension. I think strict locals is a great example of that tension. That was a solution to a very frontier problem that made a ton of sense under those circumstances, and then kind of didn't make as much sense. And I don't want people to actually use it in their not frontier application because it is an uglification of the templates. This is one of my pet peeves right now. The thing I hate most about Ruby at this moment, I do not hate a lot of things, and it's very small in the grand scheme of things. But my number one pet peeve with Ruby right now is frozen literals. Every single time I open a damn file and I see that pragma at the top, I go like, oh, I don't want to look at this. And then I submit some code to Rails and I didn't put it in, and RuboCup starts yelling at me, and I look like it, but I don't want to. I don't want to, because I know it doesn't matter for my apps, really. I totally get why we're doing it. I get the whatever, but I cannot wait to get rid of that little fucking wart. I want to cut it out with a scalpel as soon as that's doable. I think Ruby 3.4 will have it such that you can set it to whatever strict or warnings or something. So if your entire chain of all the gems you use are safe with immutable strings, you can turn it on and then you can get rid of those damn pragmas. So I'm looking forward to that. Anyway, we live with the tension. We live in the real world. We live with real pressures and real constraints and mega scale at Shopify and GitHub and the others, and more middle stand scale at the Basecamps and the Haze, and then tiny scale, the Hello World. And I would like to cram my 80 hobby projects in on a single server. And what a breath. And I think that's the payoff of having done this for 20 years. You could probably target any one of those slices. I'll just do 5%, and you could do it in X number of months. To do the whole thing, to get that width, to get that big of a tent, that's a 20-year project.
I think that's a great place to end this. I know you said you've got video and Kamal to work on. I might have to hear how, I assume you're recording this on Linux. So Your screencasting expertise on Linux is something I might have to learn about because I've been using ScreenFlow on the Mac for so long.
On Mac too, and I'll tell you, Ops Studio is freaking amazing. It's way nicer, in my opinion, than ScreenFlow. Maybe that was because I didn't use enough exotic features of ScreenFlow, but I get better quality. It's faster to do. I can arrange the multicam setup where I have the video with the screen recording and so on. Much nicer. I was shocked. I thought this was going to be one of the things where I really was going to miss my Mac. I was going, oh, I can't get all these apps I want to use. Ops Studio, that's the one to record in. And then Caden Live is the editing tool to use. We were just talking about how open source is not always great for these kind of end user applications. So that was the expectation I had. On the Mac, I used Pixelmator, and I really like that. And then the Linux version that I use for that called Pinta, that's not as good. That illustrates this point that, like, you know what? Pixelmator is at a different level, at different refinement and whatnot. And then I just assumed that'd be the same for video editing, and totally not. Ops Studio is really polished, super fast, great quality, exceptional piece of software to use. And Caden Live, maybe aesthetically isn't as pleasing as you would, but I actually find it easier to use. I'm much faster at doing my whole thing. When I would do my videos on the Mac, I had this really wonky, this app, and then the ScreenFlow, and then the other thing, and the positive video, and blah. And I thought, like, that's just as good as it's going to get. Linux was a step up. This is this weird thing where my default assumption is it's always going to be harder on Linux, right? And I go in thinking, that's true. And then I get these surprises. The other surprise I had was I have a Brother laser printer, and I've always had problems getting it to... I get it working on the Mac, and then I want to print something 2 weeks later, and I fucking can't find it, and I got to restart it. And then I get on Linux, and I'm like, oh, man, I now got to find some weird file and change some text configuration. And I just go, Control P. Oh, it's already there. And I'm like, print? And then the thing comes out. I'm like, what? How is this easier on Linux? That's not what the meme says. So there's been examples of the opposite with other things. But when it comes to printers and when it comes to screen casting and recording and editing, Linux is A+, very good, highly recommended.
Well, I might have to try that out. It kind of makes sense because there are some of those genius engineers working on FFmpeg and doing some crazy cool stuff on Linux with that. So it does kind of make sense if video stuff is really good on Linux after all. So that's cool. Well, thanks for spending all the time with us you did today. We're super excited for all the new Rails 8 stuff. I'm just about ready to push up some final upgrade stuff to Rails 8, but then we have such good stuff to look forward to in 8.1 as well. That's probably my favorite part of Rails World is you get a taste of here's the cool new stuff you get today, but also here's where we're going, which we don't get enough sometimes of where are we headed, because that keeps the excitement going between the conferences and all that. And these are just the
cadence. Rails World has really set the cadence that we will release a new version of Rails at Rails World, as we'll try very hard to make that the default. And we will try to make this the default for revealing anything that's cooking. It won't always line up. I think this was an exceptional Rails World. It's not always we're going to have a major version to show. It's not always everything's going to be shipping literally the same day. A lot of effort went into doing that. So I want to make sure we level set our expectations a little bit that Rails World in Amsterdam in a year is probably not going to have Rails 9 with like just as much new crazy stuff. Who knows? But it's going to be an awesome show regardless. And we're going to time a release of Rails with it. And I'm always going to talk about the things that I'm excited about, which usually is new stuff from novel problems that we're facing at 37 Signals.
Well, we love it. We appreciate everything that you do. So we will talk to you soon.
All right. Thanks for having me on.